All right, well, the clock's ticking, so I might get started on our final discussion for today, which is on fighting misinformation and disinformation. I'll begin that by acknowledging that we're on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples and acknowledge their continuing culture and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And it's always a pleasure to be on this beautiful country to exchange ideas as people have done for thousands of years. I'm Ed O'Daly, I'm the Chief Communications Officer here at ANU. And part of my job is to start the day listening to the radio news. And last week I woke to the breaking news that Vladimir Putin had a heart attack. It was followed by the hasty caveat that this unverified report came from a Telegram account believed to be close to the Kremlin. And that story quietly disappeared. We've had insurrections in the US following baseless claims from an outgoing president that an election had been stolen. We've seen the successful campaign to leave the EU in my native UK based on a false claim painted on the side of a bus about the millions of pounds going to the EU and not to the NHS. Throughout COVID, there was misinformation across social media confusing people. My colleague Peter Yu early this afternoon talked about misinformation and the Voice campaign. We see media organisations having to hire fact-checkers to debunk the baseless claims they see. So we're in a time where misinformation and disinformation spreads rapidly and fake news can significantly shape perceptions. And as my colleague Liz Allen said today very powerfully, perception is more powerful than reality. And with foreign powers seeking to weaponize disinformation to undermine us, this is a really important issue to tackle, which is why it's great that I have such a solid panel of experts here to help me go through this issue. What I'll do to begin with, I'll introduce each of them very briefly and ask them the first question, which is that we're going to try, without getting too tied up into a philosophical discussion about the nature of truth, to agree what we all mean by misinformation and disinformation. So I'll start by introducing Dr. Jennifer Duxbury, who's the Director of Policy, Regulatory Affairs and Research at the Digital Industry Group, and ask her, so Jenny, what are misinformation and disinformation?
So I think the first thing I'd say is that this isn't actually something new. It's not a new phenomenon. It goes back, way back into our history. So for example, at the time of the French Revolution, pamphlets were being distributed by the supporters of the revolution, which contained significant misinformation about the monarchy. But what is new is, in this day and age, it is the scale and speed at which it can be propagated in online spaces. Defining what is mis and disinformation is really important, not just as a philosophical question, but if we want to think about this as a policy problem that we have to tackle, we need to be able to define it quite precisely. So I'm going to give you a definition which was developed by the signatories to the Australian Code of Practice on Misinformation and Disinformation, which is a policy initiative that I was involved in and had a role in developing the code in response to the request for the last government to develop this code. So when we think about mis and disinformation, we think about false and misleading content, but it is verifiably false and misleading, and it poses a credible and foreseeable threat of harm to social goods such as democratic and policy-making processes, health, security, the environment, and vulnerable and marginalised groups. What distinguishes misinformation from disinformation is the behaviours by which it is disseminated online. So when we think about disinformation, we think about calculated actions which are designed to either amplify particular false discourses or to suppress other genuine, authentic discourses. And that is done through strategies which sort of manipulate the way that people engage in-line. So using trolls, for example, you can actually buy misinformation campaigns on the dark web where you buy a certain number of trolls which are using accounts to propagate these discourses or control them, and bots and artificial intelligence to manipulate online discourse. But I want to acknowledge that this is just one definition. This is a very contested space. Academics don't agree on what this concept means. We know that these terms are used often in political discourse to attack opponents' positions in political debates. And we know also that the Australian public's view of what is mis and disinformation is very largely driven by their values, attitudes and belief to the content that they encounter.
Well, to see if an academic agrees, I might ask one that I have here. Dr. Erin Newman, my ANU colleague from the School of Medicine and Psychology, what is it to you, misinformation and disinformation?
So I'd have to say I actually agree with a lot of what Jenny just shared there. In psychology, we take a much more narrow definition, which is really just looking at false information in general. And for us, when we're studying misinformation and disinformation, some of the key differences actually end up being the extent to which disinformation ends up leveraging some of the psychological vulnerabilities that are present when we encounter information in general. So I think that would be the addition from me as the academic on the panel.
Excellent. And finally, Mike Bareja, who's the Deputy Director of Cyber Technology and Security at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Disinformation and misinformation to you?
Again, largely agree
Excellent.
with the definition there. Maybe if I can add a little bit of grey area around that is that, we talk about it being false information and false information that's either on purpose or not on purpose, essentially being the differentiation. One of the areas we need to think about as well is the inauthentic behaviour around information that's not false. So pushing information and bad behaviour around how that information is pushed out could be seen as mis or disinformation when the information itself is either completely true or just an opinion. So we see that a lot with the way nation states work in this space in pushing their particular views on contentious issues which don't have a clear-cut answer. They're just an opinion. They're just a way they want things to work. And so taking that message and using inauthentic behaviour like bot swarms and troll farms and other things which amplify that message and drown out any other message, even though the information itself isn't particularly false, is that mis or disinformation?
Thanks. So, Erin, you sort of alluded to this, but what's the psychology behind it? What makes us believe mis and disinformation?
Yes, I think there are several factors here, so I'll limit my answer to highlighting a few key vulnerabilities. So ideally when we encounter information, we're engaging in deliberation and carefully weighing facts and evidence to decide what we think is real. But we know that that takes cognitive resources and that takes time. So in general, what we see people doing is going with the gut, which means evaluating information based on how it feels. And so, for example, when information comes to mind easily because it's been repeated several times, we know that people are inclined to call that information true, credible, trustworthy, and they like it more. And so what we know from psychological research is that simple repetition can increase the chances that people believe something, and that pattern holds true even when people have general knowledge that they could otherwise apply to reject the information they've encountered. So repetition, massively powerful force in shifting around people's beliefs. And I mean, as Jenny noted, this is not something as new, it's just amplified. Another point I'd make is that people are more inclined to agree with information that's consistent with their identities and consistent with their in-groups. And we also know from psychological research there that it's not that people just simply are more inclined to believe, but people actually invest less effort in critiquing the information that they encounter that's consistent with their beliefs. And then beyond that, ideally, when we encounter information, we're sensitive to source quality cues, and we go ahead and then remember that source information later on. But we know that people typically neglect source information and they have a hard time recalling it over long periods of time. And then the last thing I'd say, just to keep it brief, is that we have an affinity for emotional content. So when there's emotional language, it grabs our attention, we're convinced by it, it's persuasive. And so when that gets wrapped up in mis and disinformation, that's a worrying recipe.
Thank you, and thanks for the brevity. Ours is the most compressed session of the day. So, Mike, from a sort of national standpoint, who are the actors that are actively trying to misinform us? What are they doing? Are they, and to what extent are they willfully after our democracy trying to undermine it.
Yes, absolutely, they are. An interesting way to differentiate them is, say, nation states and everyone else, because nation states are kind of a special category and the most capable and most prolific as well. So essentially anyone with an agenda to push and a relaxed attitude to ethics is going to be doing this. ASPI has, for example, a website which is the Information Ops Tracker, which on there we list 17 countries and the identified information operations, not exactly the same as MISDIS, but the information operations on there. So there's 17 countries already named there. The big ones that we all know are China and Russia. And, you know, we have to be direct about that in talking about what we have seen happen in the recent past and how that's changed our societies drastically. And I'm talking mainly about going back to 2016. So in 2016, we saw Brexit and we saw the US election. So in both of those instances, much more in the US election though, there is very well documented Russian mis and disinformation influence operations that changed the outcome, or thought to change the outcome of that election. It was also identified Russian interference in the Brexit campaign and, was mentioned before, the feeding of those false narratives around where money would go and what would be the result of Brexit. So we see that these kinds of campaigns happen around particular big events, and those two events really were an awakening for countries around the world about the reality of these operations and what effect they can have. But we see this happening all the time as a daily incidents around just pushing countries' perspectives on issues. So China, for example, has a range of issues that it's trying to sway public opinion on. And, you know, you can think off the top of your head, Taiwan, South China Sea, Tibet, Uyghurs, all these different things where they want to be able to have their narrative as the dominant one. So there are a range of activities that they undertake which push this mis and disinformation out through troll farms, through the co-opting of influencers who have large number of followers to have them repeat the approved messages. And this is, as I was saying earlier, a lot of things that aren't necessarily untrue or factually wrong, but it's a way to drown out dissent. It's a way to dominate a conversation, and the behaviour which is conducted to do so is seen as unethical, inauthentic. That's where I think a really important aspect of mis and disinformation needs to come in, and thinking about the way that these things are done. So, like I said, nation states are one kind of capability. The other one is the issue-motivated groups, and really all of us participating in this. So we, like Erin said, have that emotional kind of vulnerability there. We look for simple information. We want to react to what hits our heart, not our head. And we're very vulnerable to these types of things. And when we're put into a context of digital platforms which limit and refine the type of information that we're fed with pretty much the express purpose of polarising political opinion and making extremism the norm, it's almost a foregone conclusion that people are going to fall into this trap and repeat and amplify this mis and disinformation.
I mean, I guess the good news is that industry, government, individuals aren't all standing idly by while this happens. I mean, for example, the Digital Industry Group, Jenny, where you're from, produced the Code of Practice on mis and disinformation. You've got some pretty heavy-hitting tech organisations as signatories to it. As someone who helped create the code, Jenny, can you give us a sense of what signatories are doing to combat misinformation and to what extent they're motivated by defending democracy?
So just to answer the question of what motivated the signatories to develop the code, I mean, it was an outcome of the Digital Platforms Inquiry that it was recommended that we needed some sort of regulatory response, and the signatories to the code agreed to that and agreed to develop the code on that basis. In terms of what the code does, it's only 2 years old, so it's still, relatively new self-regulatory instrument. And it has 8 signatories at the moment, including some of those, big tech social media companies like Meta, like TikTok, X, and LinkedIn. But it also has other signatories that believe that they can make a contribution to this issue, such as Adobe, that does a lot of work in the content authenticity space, which is going to be very relevant now that we are seeing the emergence of generative AI and the potential of generative AI to create quite confusing content as well. It is a principles-based approach. It has, unlike the EU code, it has a couple of mandatory commitments that all signatories make, the most important one being to introduce safeguards that reduce the spread of dis and misinformation online. And there are a range of different approaches that signatories take to that issue, because the signatories themselves are quite diverse players in the ecosystem, and also because the way in which this problem manifests is constantly evolving, and the tech and the tactics that are being used to propagate mis and disinformation online are constantly evolving as well. But they include things like labelling content that may potentially be false and misleading, reducing the visibility of that material. It does include removing material. That is definitely the preferred strategy for dealing with disinformation, removing inauthentic accounts and removing content that is being disseminated by inauthentic means. It also includes, as I said, things like these initiatives that are designed to help people check the provenance of information. Another mandatory commitment is around transparency, so the signatories all publish annual transparency reports. We've got 3 of those now. That's a work in progress. We're working to improve the transparency of the measures that they take. We also have a range of opt-in commitments that signatories will sign on to depending on the nature of their business. So, for example, if they carry political advertising, they make commitments to improve the transparency of the sources of political advertising, and they do, some really good work in this area. So, for example, you can check out on Meta, who is paying for particular advertising campaigns and the amount of spend that they have. And another important example of an opt-in commitment is about ensuring that users have access to diverse sources of information and good quality sources of information. So another really important initiative, I think one of the most important one, is actually elevating authoritative sources of content. Really important when we have processes, electoral processes running, that signatories are taking steps to actually point people into those authoritative sources.
So at a sort of individual level, Erin, you've been involved in creating a debunking handbook. So what can we all do to arm ourselves against disinformation?
I think I'd add to what Jenny said is that is also an emerging area. So the moment we put out our debunking handbook, there's emerging science giving us signals about what we should be moving to next. And when you look at that research, some of the key things we should be thinking about are implementing opportunities to pause and ask questions. How do I know that this is true? When you get people to do that, they become much better at discerning information, and they're actually better at sharing more accurate content. So we know pausing's good. If you were in earlier sessions this morning, you would have heard about digital or media literacy interventions. Those things have been taught at earlier ages, which is great, but we know that with research on adults, that teaching people about how to be smart about testing the quality of information, laterally searching, that means not just looking at one website, but it's the same information appearing elsewhere, and actually thinking about where a photo has emerged from. I think we've seen recently that imagery is real, so it doesn't fit our definitions of misinformation, but it has been repurposed and paired with other information, which creates something quite nefarious that people can't easily detect. So it's beyond engaging in the skills that I'm talking about, pausing, digital and media literacy, people actually also need to have the cognitive capacity and the motivation to actually do it. Because a lot of having this information available is fantastic, but if you are in a digital environment that doesn't allow you space to engage in a more effortful manner, then we're going to find ourselves in a very troubling situation where we are relying on gut reactions to information. So the pieces I'm adding here are really around motivation and cognitive effort and capacity to do that. And I do want to note that we can continue to arm ourselves and create cognitive toolkits, etc., and education around this space, but there are limits. So if you look at the more recent research on AI, looking at people's responses to AI faces, people tend to be pretty confident that they can tell the difference between the two. The disturbing data, however, is that people are more inclined to classify an AI face as a real face. That's when they're encountering those two different types. They're more likely to call AI real, and further, they're more likely to trust AI faces, having implications for what it means when we pair AI faces with other content we encounter. And then just to add one more disturbing note, when I talked about our reliance on feelings, so the impact of repetition on our perceptions of what is true, people often react with, well, you know, that wouldn't affect me, I'm a deep thinker, or I'm an intelligent person. But the research shows that there just are no reliable individual difference measures that explain variance in people's responses to repeated information. So these are things we need to worry about.
Thanks. So, I mean, we can all do our best to arm ourselves, the industry's doing its bit, but there are still these sort of nefarious nations and other organisations out there, Mike, trying to get at us. What's the sort of national security apparatus doing to protect Australia?
Well, there's quite a lot happening in the bigger space of foreign interference. And mis and disinformation and foreign influence and foreign interference, the Australian government has really pushed very hard into this space over the last few years. And so I see that there has been a massive implementation of countering foreign interference in home affairs. ASIO obviously has a huge role in that. There is a better understanding of how these things work, and those examples of Brexit and especially the 2016 election were that kind of wake-up call. Or I should say actually that mis and disinformation for a long time, forever, has been, like Jennifer was saying, it's been around forever, and it's really the bread and butter of intelligence in a way. So it's not new, but it's the effect of it and how it's shaping our society that really came through in that 2016 US election, which showed that we needed to do something, and we needed to do something now. And so there's been this bigger effort towards countering foreign interference. Now, in that, mis and disinformation has sort of filtered out into a more discrete component, and we have the ACMA bill, which is was out for consultation recently, is obviously not part of national security or intelligence, but a way of feeding into that larger approach to resilience and how do we protect information, protect, like Erin was saying, the minds, I guess, of our people in Australia, and make them resilient to these sorts of threats. That's something that's been very well recognised and acted upon in the Australian government. There is a countering foreign interference strategy, which is classified in Home Affairs. There's a whole division there, I think it is now. It's half of ASIO's job. There's little bits of that peppered throughout many other parts of the intelligence apparatus as well. But overall, this is looking at how we make Australia, its institutions and its people more resilient to this risk of a post-truth world, which the Chief of the Defence Force mentioned at the ASPI conference in September, talking about this truth decay and him looking towards the future and thinking about how we are facing this post-truth world, and that people are more likely to be making decisions on feeling rather than on facts. This is, I suppose my point is, it's very well recognised, and there's been a lot of resources put into mobilising to address this issue.
Thanks. I'd like to talk a bit more about the ACMA bill, actually. I mean, that was those powers that are coming to the Australian Communications and Media Authority. Now, they're explicitly, and this is from the the consultation website. They're because misinformation and disinformation pose a threat to the safety and well-being of Australians, as well as to our democracy, society and economy. So exactly what we're talking about here. I guess, Jenny, from the industry, what's in the legislation and how's it going to work for you?
So, so we're very supportive of the need for legislation here. We have a self-regulatory code, but we do want to see the ACMA formally empowered to oversight what industry is doing to tackle this issue. We think that's really important. The basic building blocks of the code we also, of the legislation, sorry, we also agree with, which is giving ACMA power to gather information about what companies are doing and keep records, and also giving the ACMA power to request binding self-regulatory codes and standards. So at a high level, we think this is a really important piece of the puzzle of how we go about tackling this issue in Australia. I would say we have raised or made a number of recommendations about how we think that this legislation can be improved. Principally, we have concerns about the very broad scope of content that the government is seeking to regulate. It's a great deal broader than what we've sought to tackle under the self-regulatory code. So, for example, it includes content that could contribute to harming institutions, and institutions is an undefined term. So that's potentially any content actually that's posted online. If you think institutions is a very broad concept, right? It's not even just political institutions, and even if we were to confine it to political institutions, we're including things like the executive government, the Prime Minister's office, as well as a range of different regulatory agencies. So that's a pretty broad scope. But if we actually think of institutions, that's also things like marriage, the Constitution, federalism. It's just not clear what we're trying to capture there. And we're also expecting that platforms can kind of like crystal gaze into the future at some point, maybe 20 or 30 years hence, and anticipate how individual items of content might accumulate over time and do some kind of damage there. So I don't think that that's a really helpful way of thinking about regulating this space, because ultimately we are talking about regulating lawful speech. Lawful speech. And so I think that's a very precious commodity in a democracy, and we should be just really cautious about the scope of what we want to regulate. And then secondly, the types of businesses that are in scope. There's a large range of digital services that are in scope, including just ordinary websites that have content from different sources. We think that this really should be focused on those kinds of environment where there's a risk of this kind of information being propagated at scale by users, not ordinary websites. So that's one of the concerns of the bill, but generally speaking, the idea of legislation is one that we support.
There's a bit of enthusiastic nodding there at times, Mike. I mean, I guess if it's something that's both protecting our democracy but also potentially controlling some of the institutions that make democracy so strong and valuable. I mean, what's your perspective on the bill?
Yeah, no, I largely agree. I think that there are a lot of ambiguities that need to be addressed. And even though I was introducing some of those ambiguities when I talked about the behaviour, inauthentic behaviour, and what is the mis and disinformation, and does it need to be false and those sorts of things. But when you're regulating, you need to always be very specific about what you're regulating and how it's regulated. And it's always must be done with the utmost care to determine how much power you're giving governments, because that power, even if it is really well defined in an initial regulation, can be expanded or can be just abused. And, I won't name examples, but there are examples of Australian legislation that I don't agree with, that I think have been abused in the security realm. Another example of this space in particular is in 2021 in India. So Modi was cracking down on the farmers' strike, and there was information around the farmers' strike and support for the farmers, and he was cracking down on this dissent. And so in the end, Indians ended up arresting one of the organisers of this, what they saw as misinformation on Twitter, threw him in jail, and then they threatened to arrest and fine Twitter employees who had nothing to do with it. People just worked at Twitter in the US. India wanted to fine those people. So you can see that there is a potential for this overreach or abuse of these regulations when they come in. So totally agree, we need to really define well what we're talking about. And in a way, I don't mind if we actually make the regulation, on the one hand, more powerful by giving government more power to do things, because at the moment the ACMA bill doesn't really include any powers. But refining down at the same time the things that they can use that power on. So going to a very definite definition of mis and disinformation, resolving those issues around what are institutions, all those different things, I think is probably a better way of going than having a big, ambitious but ambiguous set of regulation.
Thanks. So, Erin, so moving on from the legislative side of things and reflecting on some of what you've said and also some of the things we've heard today. I mean, earlier on, Emily Jenke was talking about our democratic muscles, and I'm wondering if one of the democratic muscles we need to develop is the one that helps us spot mis and disinformation. There was an earlier session on civics education where there was an observation about digital natives, and if there even is such a thing. So I guess if we're going to be protecting ourselves, where do we start the education? Who are the people we need to worry about most? You know, can we just leave the young people to it because they've grown up with this stuff, or is it actually the cynical old people who can spot when they're being hoodwinked?
Yeah, I think the comment was around digital natives. And I think when you look at the literature, the short answer is that everyone needs work on this front. And when you look at some of the research on lifespan cognition and vulnerability from very young to very old in terms of some of these cognitive biases, it's very consistent. You're seeing these patterns emerge at a very young age, things like repetition, and they hold on over the course of the lifespan. So we need to be thinking about, and we, clearly from what I've heard today, we already are thinking about how we can educate our kids around digital literacy, media literacy, but that also needs to be integrated into what we're teaching people who have missed out on that educational opportunity. And we were chatting today around one of the big challenges there is actually increasing motivation to gain that education and creating space in our digital environments to do the hard work in terms of assessing what's quality and what's not. When you look at certain populations, there are vulnerabilities that I think are meaningful and we should be attending to. So when you look at older populations, there are shifts that are just borne out simply from how cognition changes over time. So it gets harder to remember and recollect sources of information with increasing age. And then the more recent literature shows that it also gets harder to detect alterations to photographs if you've not regularly been using that kind of technology. And the other thing we know relates to some of the transparency practices, which are fantastic, but may not actually work in terms of the way people encode and make sense of information on a day-to-day basis. So something could be clearly labelled as sponsored, but when it's embedded in an environment where it's very hard to pick up on that information or where you're not attending to that information, people can miss it. And that's also particularly true of our older adults.
Thanks. We've talked a lot about tech and new media, and so before we go to questions, I wouldn't mind talking briefly about the traditional media. I mean, and my ANU colleague Mark Kenny wrote a piece just before the referendum about what he called fake balance, which again Stan Grant was very powerful on last night, this idea of giving equal time to two sides, whether they're true or false. And back a very long time ago when I was learning to be a journalist, I was given that lesson about it's not your job when someone tells you it's raining to find someone who tells you it's not. It's your job to look out the window and see if it's raining. And I think that fake balance of bringing in different sides of an argument, whether they've got something to say or not, is is potentially harming the quality of debate. So I guess while we've got these measures in place for the industry, what about for the news media that's rushing to report Vladimir Putin's death with caveats, only to discover later that they were wrong? Jenny, any thoughts on what the traditional media can be doing to keep up with your members?
Yeah, so I worked in the traditional media for a very long time, much longer than I've worked in the digital space. I worked at Reuters for 10 years, and an interesting organisation, because the first news organisation transmitting 24-hour news across the globe, worldwide, well in advance of the internet, via its private satellite system. And one of the things that was really interesting about working there was the passionate conviction of journalists of the importance of their independence to report things the way that they see fit, and their important role as watchdogs in democratic societies. And of course I saw that firsthand, because I was very closely involved in the journalist covering wars from the Bosnian War right through to the Iran and the Iraq wars as well. So I'm a person who really, really believes in the importance of independent journalism and the right of media to self-regulate as well. However, that said, there is no doubt that we have seen instances of media propagating misinformation, and there's certainly some research that indicates some very large, more conservative media organisations having had a role in propagating disinformation as well. So I think that as important stakeholders in the ecosystem, it's really important that journalists acknowledge that they have an important role to play here. If you look at the Australian environment, there's a number of self-regulatory and co-regulatory codes in place for broadcasts and the main mastheads as well, but they don't actually really contain any commitments around what is the role that media sees itself playing here. So I think it's an important question, because I'm not necessarily going to say that the answer here is that we should be introducing legislation to regulate the media, but I think we do have to acknowledge that they are really important players here, and that they do have an important role to play, and that they need to step up.
Erin, do you want anything to add on that? Or even a closing comment before we go to questions?
I'll be super brief in case Mike has a chance. I think a couple of extra pieces I'd throw out there are that when you have that what is called balanced reporting, when there's not a balance of evidence, there's a real risk of pushing around perceived social consensus at large. So I think that's one of the big risks. When you talk about traditional media outlets, what we saw as a result of the COVID pandemic is that when you actually look at the data, people who had a reliance on traditional media outlets were more inclined to adhere to advice and were less hesitant regarding vaccines. So we know that they're doing good, but I am concerned about risks with balanced reporting.
Mike?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it needs to be on a case-by-case basis in a way, because there are tendencies to present two sides to an issue when there isn't two sides to an issue, even though some people would claim there are. And so, in a post-truth world of everyone's opinion being their own and subjective, on the one hand, for some things you can entertain that, but for example, to place a Holocaust denier on the same level as the Simon Wiesenthal Centre is morally repugnant. You can't do that. But for other things, you can, where there are genuine debates around what is this event, what does it mean. And one really interesting one that is still a very serious one just recently was the rocket attack on the hospital in Gaza. So going back to traditional media, was that New York Times front page headline, Israel hits hospital, or whatever it was exactly. I'm doing a lot of ASPI publicity for this, but an analyst named Nathan Ruza, who does a lot of work on Twitter, and he's an open source intelligence analyst, mainly an imagery analyst, and he did a big analysis of all the open source information around this, and globally he was the primary thread that everyone around the world went to understand what really happened. And he was the one that really revealed that it was most likely a misfired Hamas or Palestinian Jihad rocket. And so he went through all of these very structured analyses of imagery and comparing it to previous explosions and where it was on maps and satellite imagery and all these different things to come to a conclusion that it was very, very likely, can't know for sure of course, but highly likely that it was a misfired rocket from Gaza. At the same time, you had another open source information analysis organisation called Forensic Architecture, I believe they're called. Very credible organisation, very well known, have done a lot of fantastic work. They did a similar thing and came to the opposite conclusion. They said, all of our analysis shows that most likely it was an Israeli rocket hitting the hospital. So you come to these kind of cases where even when you're examining all the information and it's a field ripe for dis and misinformation, and mis and disinformation has historically been a defining element of that particular conflict, that you have these opposing viewpoints that, in that case, need to be entertained.
Thanks. Now, my forum co-chair here is on the clock and is about to give me the hurry up, but I reckon we can squeeze in one more question from the audience. There is one before we wrap for the day. I think microphone's coming your way.
Glenn Withers, the focus has appropriately been especially upon misinformation and controlling and regulating and legislating in that negative sense of stopping that. Is there a way forward on encouraging positive, independent journalism? I'm not sure that the digital platform mechanisms do that. They support the big entrenched interests. I'm thinking of things like Pearls and Irritations and Michael West and so on, where you've got well-attested, well-informed contributors, former heads of Prime Minister and Cabinet and Secretaries of Finance and so on, and yet they're always scrabbling for survival. Have you got some positive ideas as to how we can encourage such independent journalism at the immediate funding level, or is it even behind that to education arrangements and the way we teach and encourage understanding of the role of journalism? Because that informed intermediation seems to be what's missing and not there and trusted as much as it should be.
Colleagues, thoughts?
I think what's exciting is that kind of independent open source analysis, which is really more well equipped than ever to conduct its mission, because we have more information out there than ever. More mobile phone recordings, more satellite imagery, more sound recordings, and you have like whistle signatures, all these different things that feed into it. These organisations are fulfilling a similar role to what you're describing there, but are doing it in a way that's more sustainable in terms of the funding and the way that they support themselves. Those other independent traditional media, if you will, kind of outlets, fantastic work. I would prefer if we had more of them and they were more well known, but very hard to financially survive.
I mean, one thing I might sneak in myself, if I can have a quick indulgence as chair, is that there are these other sources, places like, the universities going through things like The Conversation, and I would be remiss not to give a quick plug to our policy blog that we're going to set up at ANU, which is exactly for this purpose, is to give you information you can trust. So that's a tick for me there. So, I mean, I think this is where these other organisations can come in, which have that credibility and that independence and a bit of cash behind them as well. I think that's probably one of the ways we can plug that gap. I might thank the panel and hand to Janine.
I hate to stop the conversation, but I've got my eye on the clock, and I know that we've got the hardcore stayers here with us today. Thank you, Ed, and to the panellists. Please join me in a round of applause for our excellent panel. And what a great way it is to end the ANU Crawford Leadership Forum for this year. I know I speak for many people in saying how great the conversations have been today and also last night for those of you who could join us at the dinner. Each year the forum addresses key issues for the present and the future of Australia and the world. And I must say, when Ed sent me a quick message saying, hey, how about co-chairing the forum with me this year, I was like, why not? It's my first year. Perhaps that wasn't my first thought, but I thought it's my first year in my job as the director of the Crawford School. How could I say no to that? He's already lined me up for next year. It's been a real delight, and there's been many highlights of the program today. I was going to attempt to synthesise those in 30 seconds, but that seems ridiculous. What we've agreed to do is put together a short piece, and perhaps we'll have that as part of the launch of the policy brief. I think it would be a great way to reflect on what has been an amazing conversation for us. Excuse me. I need to get my thank yous correct. So as I prepare to close the forum for this year, I would really like to thank particularly our panellists, those of you who have travelled down the road or from across the country. We really appreciate you making the time to be with us. To our wonderful chairs who've convened these conversations, which have been incredible. I would like to express, I don't even know how to express my thanks to Professor Stan Grant, who last night delivered an exceptional oration. It was painful, it was powerful, and I think it will reverberate for a long time to come. I found it captivating, as I know many people did. To our wonderful audience, thank you again for attending. To our VC, our Chancellor, and members of our council, all who have been incredibly supportive. There's nothing like being in a university. It's a small university. People forget that about ANU. It punches far above its weight. But we had calls with the Chancellor about the program, the topics, the people. This is really unheard of in most institutions, to have such interest and involvement. And members of our council giving of their time to come and be involved has been incredible. These things don't happen overnight. They take many, many months. And we've had a very hard-working team working on that. And the hardest working have been the ones that you've been seeing running around making everything look very easy today. Pam, Shruti, Neil and Damesh, you've done an amazing job behind the scenes, making it into a wonderful event, and I've really appreciated working with you. Oh, my voice is almost gone. I still have a voice for Minister Katie Gallagher tomorrow, so I'll have to stop in a minute. All of our sessions, with the exception, I think, of one, which was Chatham House Rules, were recorded and will be available online. So please check the ANU Events website in the coming days. And, of course, keep your eyes peeled for the policy brief coming soon. Special thanks to Mirvac for their support in running the Leadership Forum. I really hope you've enjoyed the chance to step away from other things, to spend some time with us, and we've really appreciated you doing it. Thank you very much.